So tonight we're going to look at one of my heroes, Wilberforce, and how he managed to campaign for financial justice and learn some lessons from that, and then start to think about what we might want to campaign on in order to be able to bring about more financial justice in the world. And so a bit of a summary and a recap of a lot of the things that we have looked at, but then we'll discuss that more. So Wilberforce is one of my complete heroes. You can see the dates there, giving you context of his life. Born in 1759, died in 1833. I guess I have to do the disclaimer that's not actually William Wilberforce. So I've only got a couple of pictures of him in this. This is kind of taken from a longer presentation I do on Wilberforce. People say that he wasn't as photogenic in real life. He was actually sometimes nicknamed the Shrimp because he was short and he had curvature of his spine and slightly hunched over. So I've gone with the Hollywood version. So that is, what's his name? Ioan Gruffudd, the Welsh actor. So if you've seen the film Amazing Grace that came out in 2007 and commemorated the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade, because that happened in 1807, then this is a still from that film. Great film. And there are some bits where they play around with it, but it does a pretty good job of telling the story of that campaign that Wilberforce was instrumental. He was the key leader in 20-year campaign that enabled got the British to abolish the slave trade. And then he started a separate campaign internationally to get other major powers to abolish the slave trade as well. So those are the dates of his life, and that's the Hollywood version of him, looking slightly better looking than he did in real life. In fact, is my next slide a picture of him. There you go. That's the real one. When he was a young man, I think in his mid-20s. I'm not sure if that is one of the wigs that were fashionable at the time, and that's why his hair looks grayer than it probably was in that context. But not too bad looking a guy. I think that was when he was in his mid-20s, but he aged and had a lot of health problems. His great collaborator, or his great collaborators, actually, no, not collaborator, that's the wrong way of saying it. His best friend, who was involved in the campaign, but maybe not as instrumental as he could have been, was the Prime Minister of the time, William Pitt, not Benedict Cumberbatch. He's the guy that plays him in the film Amazing Grace, one of his first breakout film roles, but that is the actual, or at least painting, the nearest we've got of William Pitt the Younger. And so they became best friends. They entered politics together as young men. Pitt became prime minister at the age of 24. If you ever want to read a biography and feel like you're not doing well in life, and not living up to the mark, read Pitt the Younger, because he's prime minister at the age of 24. He'd already turned it down 3 times. The king had asked him if he would take on the role, and he kept turning it down. And then finally, the grand age of 24 is like, okay, I will take it on. And he was prime minister for 17 years after that. And the two were best friends. And Pitt played a role, I guess, in abolishing the slave trade, although he could have done a lot more and could have done it faster. And it was actually one of his successors that was prime minister, William Grenville, when the abolition of the slave trade finally went through in 1807. But okay, a bit more context. The British are the leading slave traders of the day at this point. They're taking 40,000 slaves a year from West Africa to North America and the West Indies in this trade that was massively lucrative. It's called the triangular trade. As you can see, the triangular journey that the ships took, they went from Britain down to the coast of West Africa and took on slaves there, took them across to North America, and they would sell the slaves to the plantation owners in North America and in the Caribbean, and they would then buy sugar, tobacco, cotton, the raw goods that were being manufactured on the plantations by the slavers, and then they'd bring that back to the British Isles and sell those raw goods there to the cotton manufacturers in the Northwest or whatever. And it was such a lucrative trade because a good slave trader would make profits on all 3 legs of the journey, and that's why it was such a challenge when Wilberforce and a few others, just a small number of people, said, hang on, this is unjust. We want to do something about this. So I'm not going to tell the full story. Maybe we should do that another time. But just some principles in terms of this 20-year campaign of how Wilberforce and a small group of friends managed to take on the financial sector of the day and win this amazing victory for justice. Wilberforce actually thought, you know what, as soon as I tell the truth about how awful this practice is and the conditions, especially that the slaves have to endure on what they called the Middle Passage, which was, that middle section of the journey from West Africa to the Americas, as soon as people hear about how awful the conditions are, then they will quickly vote to abolish the trade. That was his naivety. And then after the first 2 years of campaigning and finally getting to bring the bill to Parliament and it's voted down, Wilberforce famously says this: you can choose to look the other way, but you can never again now say you did not know. And he spent the next 18 years continuing to campaign on this. And it took them 20 years from beginning in, 1787 to 1807, when the slave trade was finally abolished by the British Parliament. Amazing story of 20 years of how they continued to fight. So how did they do it? They're trying to change the law. Ultimately, they're trying to get this slave trade to become illegal. So Parliament is the battleground for how you change the law. But they quickly realized that they're fighting massive business interests. Okay, bit of artistic license. The City of London didn't look like that 200 years ago, but they were fighting against the traders that were making money from this massively lucrative triangular trade, who were based in the City of London. They used to mainly operate out of Jamaica Coffee House, which is now Jamaica Wine House, still there in the City of London. So it opened my eyes, this, when I first realized this, because I had, before I wrote the book on Wilberforce, I had, I suppose, naively assumed Wilberforce is this kind of one good moral Christian MP fighting against all of these evil, morally bankrupt MPs, and realized, no, it's not that simple at all. His fight wasn't so much against Parliament. Parliament's the battleground where the fight took place. His fight was against the West Indian merchants and plantation owners that are making money from it. It's the business interests that are making such a huge profit from the scheme that they want to oppose any change to it. So Parliament is the battleground, but the real fight is against the business people making the money off the evil practice. How did they manage to change the minds of people in Parliament? They did this 20-year campaign that involved the media, the entertainment industry, and the church. And they kind of mobilized those three spheres to be able to create a movement across the whole country, which eventually put enough pressure on the MPs that they said, okay, we are going to change the law on this and we are going to abolish it, because MPs are nothing if not open to changes in public opinion. That's how MPs keep their job. So when they realized that there was enough of a movement within the country wanting to abolish the slave trade, the MPs end up falling into line. Now, I had mistakenly thought, oh, the MPs are the bad guys in this story because they're the one resisting it. Well, it's not that simple. The bad guys, I guess, and you could argue, is it helpful or not to say that, but the bad guys are the West Indian plantation owners or the North American plantation owners that are making the money off the backs of slavery and the slave trade. That's who Wilberforce was fighting against. Parliament was simply the battleground. How did he manage to bring about the change? By mobilizing the media, the arts, and the church to create a grassroots movement that transformed the mood of the country and then forced the MPs to fall into line. And people say that this was kind of the first time there had been a mass movement like this, certainly in a mass movement led by people that weren't directly benefiting from it themselves, but they're advocating on behalf of another group, people that are being kidnapped and enslaved from West Africa and sold onto the plantations. So it became the model that so many other campaigns looked back to in terms of, how do we fight for justice? How do we campaign on issues and bring about a change? Well, we need to change the law. To do that, you need to change Parliament. Okay, so create a mass movement using media, the arts, and the church. Some of the things that they do, they created a logo. Some people say that this is the first logo, certainly the first campaign logo that had ever been used. It was Josiah Wedgwood, the famous potter guy from Stoke-on-Trent. He was a Christian, and he created this logo with a slave kneeling, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And they used to stamp that on brooches and on plates and on, I don't think they had t-shirts in those days or tea towels, but on everything that they could kind of sell as merchandise to be able to get the word out, and people associated that image with this campaign to abolish the slave trade. And people say in many ways that was the first logo, certainly the first logo of any campaign that was trying to bring about change. They used the arts. So that's part of a famous poem by a guy, William Cowper, who is a famous poet and a Christian. And different artists, I guess, brought their talents to be able to help get the word out and teach the country how evil and how immoral the slave trade was. So one of Cowper's famous poems has this line: "Slaves cannot breathe in England. If their lungs receive our air, that moment they are free." That was because there was a moment early on in the campaign when the campaigners thought they were getting somewhere, because there was a legal judgment that was made that slavery was illegal in effect in the UK. And as soon as slaves came to the UK, because there was nothing in case law going back 800 years in England about slavery, then slavery didn't exist. So you couldn't hold someone to be a slave in England, but you could still in the West Indies and in North America, in these other places. But they used the arts to change the mood of the population, to try and therefore change the mood of the MPs. And yes, as is seen in the film, if you've seen it, they used petitions, one of the first examples of mass petitions, where they would create societies across the country and get people to sign their name so that MPs could see, wow, there is a strong public opinion around this. People genuinely want change on this issue. And they used posters, famously, like this. This is a diagram of a slave ship called the Brooks, which showed how cramped the conditions were for the slaves. So each of the tiny characters there are West African slaves that have been kidnapped. And that was the conditions that people had to endure on the Middle Passage going from West Africa to the Caribbean, which took at least 3 weeks, sometimes 6 weeks. And you see how closely chained they are together there. There's no toilets, there's a few buckets. It was pitch black most of the time under the deck. Just the conditions are horrific. And no wonder up to a third of the slaves died on the Middle Passage before they even got to the New World and can be sold. So the campaigners told those stories and used the arts, used pictures, got this stuff out into the media so that public opinion started to realize how evil or how many people were being killed in order for them to have these goods. And they started to boycott stuff. People think that possibly that was one of the world's first boycotts, when they encouraged people to stop drinking sugar in their tea, and they would say that sugar has been made with the blood of slaves, not literally, but because so many people had been killed in order to get that lump of sugar. So they would tell those stories, and they would link, and I think that's one of the key things in this sort of campaigning as well, they would link a practical thing that people could see with the big justice issue that they're fighting on, because otherwise it becomes quite an abstract thing. Oh yeah, we should try and abolish the slave trade. But then when people could see one of the effects of that, oh, why have you got sugar that's coming back from the Caribbean to be put into your tea? Where has that sugar come from? Who has been harvesting in that sugar? What are the conditions of that? It was one of the first consumer goods boycotts and was effective, even though it took 20 years, but it did shift public opinion. One of the other things that I massively learnt from the campaign, so they used the media, the arts, and the church to get the word out, was Wilberforce wasn't on his own. Again, originally I had I'd misunderstood that and thought, oh, he's just this great guy crusading on his own. I mean, he was a lone voice in Parliament for much of the time, but he had the backing of this group of friends that we now call the Clapham Sect, which is kind of an unfortunate name. They weren't a sect. They were sound Anglicans, or a couple of them were Methodists, but they were looked down upon by most of the other people at the time, certainly a lot of churchgoers and all the people that weren't churchgoers. So they called them the Clapham Sect because most of them lived in or around Clapham. But it's this really interesting, unique group of friends that each had expertise in different areas. So this guy is Henry Thornton. He was Wilberforce's best friend. Actually, they were cousins. Thornton was a massively successful business person and a banker. In fact, he was a partner in a private bank at the time. And so he helped provide some funding for the campaigns, but he provided a lot of financial understanding on how the business world worked that they were able to use in the campaigns. You've got Hannah More, who was mainly based in Bristol, but came over a lot to visit them in Clapham and was great friends with all the Clapham Sect. She was one of the most famous and gifted playwrights and poets of her day, had an evangelical conversion, and thought, why am I using my literary skills to write these plays that are just kind of worthless? This is just froth. I want to use my pen for a worthwhile cause. So she got involved with them and became one of the key writers of the group. You've got Zachary Macaulay, who was the secretary for all of the different campaigning groups that they set up and edited the Christian Observer magazine, and basically became a newspaper editor and secretary to all of these different committees. You've got James Stephen, who was a lawyer. He'd formerly worked in the West Indies and seen the conditions out there and was shocked by them, and came back to the UK and was in London, got in touch with the Clapham Sect. And as a lawyer, he was able to advise them on the exact wording that they wanted to bring to the bills that Wilberforce was presenting in Parliament to make sure that any of the loopholes were closed down. And actually, whenever there was a draft bill and Wilberforce started to get somewhere, he got Stephen in to be able to go over it. And Stephen actually wrote pretty much the bills that eventually got through in 1807, because they needed his legal brain to be able to make sure that the loopholes were closed down. And then you got a couple of other people. Thomas Babington was a country squire, and Thomas, I've forgotten his name. It's a while since I've talked about this. Thomas Gainsborough, is it? No, but Thomas somebody else. He was a clergyman, and they supported as well. And so you've got this interesting mix of skills in business, in arts, in media, in law, and in the church working together. And the Clapham Sect was never more than 10 or 12 people, but it's this group of friends who had these really interesting skills in those different areas that came together and managed to bring about this amazing victory. 20 years of campaigning, and finally they managed to get the British slave trade abolished, and the British were the leading slave traders of the day, and then campaigned to have the international slave trade abolished, which happened a few years later as well. If that's all they had done, that would be incredible. But when I studied Wilberforce and therefore started to study the Clapham Sect, I realized, oh my goodness, this small group of people achieved so much more. So yes, after a 20-year campaign, they did manage to abolish the slave trade, which would be phenomenal in itself. But they also created a haven for former slaves in what is now modern-day Sierra Leone, because there were some slaves that had been emancipated, they'd got their freedom and were living either maybe in the States or in Canada or came to the UK and basically wanted to go back to West Africa. Well, that's massively dangerous. If they end up back in West Africa, they can be kidnapped again and sent back on the Middle Passage and, re-enslaved. So they created this haven, this patch of land on West Africa, which was the beginnings of modern day Sierra Leone, where anyone who was there could not be kidnapped by the slave traders or by the other West Africans involved in that. It was this patch of free land where they could live. They also, those two things would be incredible, opened up India to missionaries. They did a separate 20-year campaign on this. The British are running India at the time through the East India Company, exploiting the nation horrifically. And the Clapham Sect hear about this and say, well, we're stealing so much wealth from this country. The very least we should do is be teaching these people about Jesus and setting up schools to educate people. And the East India Company is like, no way are we doing that. We're not telling people that they've got human rights and they're created in the image of God. That's crazy. And they made it illegal to be a missionary in India, which is why William Carey, that guy, had to actually renounce his British citizenship and became Danish for a time and lived on a Danish enclave called Serampore off the coast of India when he was there as a British missionary. The Clapham Sect hear about this and they're like, this is appalling. No, the very least we should be doing is sending missionaries to India. So it was a separate 20-year campaign. I think it was 1813, yes, when that was changed in the law, again, using the same tactics of, mobilizing the church and the arts and the media. They changed the legislation, so it was then legal to be able to send missionaries to India. Embarrassment occurs. Not many people want to go as missionaries. It's pretty dangerous. So they set up the Church Mission Society, one of the first missionary sending organizations in the West, still exists to this day. And they send missionaries to India, to the Caribbean, I think, certainly to places in Africa, to East Asia, and even as far as Australia. They sent the first missionaries to Australia and as chaplains to the prison convicts that are being shipped out there. And then they realized, okay, so we're sending missionaries across the globe. Wouldn't it be helpful if those missionaries had the scriptures translated into the local languages of the people that they're seeking to share the gospel with? So they set up the first Bible Society, the British and Foreign Bible Society, which still exists to this day. It is operating in 212 different territories or something around the world. They figured, well, if we're doing that, actually, we should probably help educate people at home to be able to read the Bible. So they started setting up some of the first Sunday schools and worked with Robert Raikes, who pioneered the Sunday school movement, to give people, the working classes who couldn't read, a free education on a Sunday morning before a church service. Those are some of the schools that Hannah More set up in the West Country near Bristol. And then they also set up the Christian Observer, which was this monthly newspaper, in effect magazine, which gave people something else to read apart from just the Bible, and was a great way for them to be able to get stories out about the different campaigns that they were involved in. This incredible legacy that this small group of people, Clapham Sect was never an official organization. You couldn't join it. It was just if you were mates with Wilberforce and Thornton, and it was never really more than 10 or 12 people involved in it. But they all have these different skills because they've got a businessman, they've got a lawyer. They had originally just one MP in Wilberforce, and then a couple of others started to stand for Parliament as well. They became known as the Saints in Parliament, this small group of 3 or 4 of them. You've got a magazine editor, Zachary Macaulay edited all of that stuff for them. The playwright, Hannah More. These people working together literally changed the world. It's incredible. And so many people now look back on the Clapham Sect as a model for, okay, if you're trying to fight for justice, how do you go about doing that? Well, you've got to change the law. How do you change the law? You need to get a bill through Parliament. How do you do that? You're probably fighting against business interests because people are going to be making money off this unjust practice. Well, you change public opinion by shifting the mood of the country through a mass movement using the arts, the media, and the church. That's how the Clapham Sect did it. And that's how now so many different NGOs and Christian groups look back and think, these guys were amazing. They pioneered this stuff. It's the same way now that we can try and lobby for change. So, okay, what does all of that mean for us if we are trying to lobby for financial justice in the 21st century? So I suppose here's my suggestions and a bit of a recap of, I think, things that we have looked at over previous months, as even a couple of years. What I'd love, and I think is vaguely realistic, I mean, it's huge and would be amazing, but I think it's realistic, actually is. How about we try and eliminate money laundering in the global economy? That, to me, is the biggest issue that we should focus on, because if we can solve that, then it's like you immediately strike a blow against the drugs trade, against the illegal people trafficking trade, against the corrupt dictators and the nefarious regimes, all these different groups that we put sanctions against, and they can continue to somehow get their money in, because we've got this global financial system that enables, if not encourages, outright money laundering. So how would we go about that? Some aims in that, and we've already discussed these, would be removing banking secrecy. And we've talked about how, in Switzerland and other places, you can turn up with a suitcase full of cash, and that facilitates money laundering. Removing corporate ownership secrecy, and the fact that so many corporations that are set up in places like the Cayman Islands, then the directors are actually just listed as another company that's registered in Luxembourg or in Panama or in, wherever, the British Virgin Islands. And so you're peeling back layers of the onion, but you can never get to who is the genuine beneficial owner of that company. Linked in with that as well, you've got the trust laws, and apparently the UK is one of the worst in this for enabling people to set up trusts that benefit their wife or their children, and therefore you don't need to declare who the beneficiaries are of the trust. It can all be hidden behind the trustees, who may not even be a person. That can be another company that's registered in the Cayman Islands, and all that kind of stuff. And it's like those three things together facilitate a huge amount of money laundering. In terms of the drugs trade, in terms of people trafficking, in terms of the arms trade, in terms of why is it that so many of the sanctions that we try and put on the global economy don't seem to have an effect, because of those three issues. Linked to that, we've talked about, and certainly Andrew is the expert here who shared with us on looking at the accountancy firms and splitting up potentially the auditing side of accountancy firms from the consultancy side, because then they are acting as poacher and gatekeeper. Is that a fair metaphor? They're the ones who are helping companies to devise ways to avoid regulation, and then signing off the accounts and saying, yeah, nothing to see here, everything is good. So should those roles be split up? And also, we've talked about, is there an argument for splitting up the big four and certainly having more competition within those accountancy firms, because is it the big four audit pretty much all of the Fortune 500 companies and all of the FTSE 100 companies. We've also talked about using technology and AI to audit every transaction in order to bring more rigor to the whole auditing process. Should we lower the audit threshold? This is all stuff that we've taken from Andrew. He's the expert here, to make sure that less stuff goes through on the nod, and that companies actually have to have more transparency on this kind of thing. Should there even be a new international auditing regulator to check properly the accounts when they are signed off for these different multinationals, or even smaller companies, if the audit threshold was reduced from, about £10 million at the moment for a company in the UK, so that there's proper scrutiny on all of that. I would suggest that's where we should focus in terms of how to eliminate money laundering in the global economy, by focusing on those things. Other ideas that we've had and we've discussed to try and bring about financial justice would be, and these were ideas we discussed, I think 2 years ago, maybe creating 100% inheritance tax was an idea. Reforming council tax would be a huge one. Having the middle classes pay for banking. We discussed using cryptocurrencies to limit inflation, so that central governments can't just print money and try and get out of deficits in that way. Not that that usually works, but they end up resorting to that. mandating people to pay 20% of their disposable income, so after they've paid rent and mortgage, into a pension pot to try and lessen pensioner poverty. Bringing in a ratio so that CEOs can only be paid maximum, say, 20 times what the lowest people in their company are paid, and making sure in that they're not just outsourcing cleaning to another, firm that are paying even less, figuring out a way of doing that. So those are other ideas that we had discussed. I think those could all be good, and that's interesting. But my suggestion would be, we can't do everything. Hey, if we can eliminate money laundering, that would be amazing. But we can discuss what's the best thing to do in all of this. Oh, and generally, yeah, we talked about educating the population more on financial literacy. Those could be good aims. Although actually, I think there are other organizations trying to do that and probably doing that well on the education piece. Then we talk specifically about London spirituality and ideas. And if you've been on prayer walks of mine in the City of London and some of the stuff we've done on that, removing Gog and Magog and the idolatry from Guildhall, reforming the City of London Corporation. This is quite general. We'd need to look more at that. But yeah, the issues there. Clarifying the role of the UK and the City of London in then regulating the tax haven network, which basically is made up of the Crown dependencies, so the Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey, the British overseas territories like the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands, and then its role within the whole global economy. Those are ideas that are specific to London that should we try and campaign on as well. And then generally, what is God's idea for a more just economy? We talked about these ideas from scripture, forbidding usury is forbidden in scripture, i.e. lending money for interest. That's a tough one because our whole economic system is kind of based on that. But in scripture, that is outlawed, and God says this is wrong, not charging people interest when you lend money, cancelling debts every 7 years as in scripture, redistributing land every 50 years. My suggestion would be, let's focus on the money laundering stuff, and is that more achievable? But maybe have some of this stuff in the back of our heads and try and move more towards this kind of a system. I'll tell you partly why. And well, because it's scriptural, because this is what God called us to do in terms of economics. But it's interesting now, let's say when the whole slavery debate is coming more and more to the fore, and people are talking about reparations and how do you atone for the economic sins of the past. And that is such, I would say, an impossible issue to start to unpick. Well, who owes who money within all of that? And how would you try to monetize, how much Ghana has been abused, or Nigeria or Cote d'Ivoire through the slave trade, and, all of that. Whereas, is redistributing land every 50 years actually the fairest way of bringing about an economic reset? So rather than the fight for reparations that some people are saying should happen in terms of making reparation for the slave trade, I wonder whether, well, going back to, it shouldn't be a surprise, is it, going back to biblical wisdom, redistribution of land would be a much fairer way of trying to redress those wrongs. But my suggestion would be, let's focus on, say, the money laundering stuff, and then have these more in the background. Maybe we put together a separate list of, yes, this would be the ideal, but how far can you get to that? Whereas actually, it's huge, but I think genuinely eliminating money laundering is achievable in the global economy, and is something that most people would support, because they would recognize, yeah, that's wrong, and that is causing so many other injustices like drugs trade, people trafficking, etc. Okay, how to go about doing that, and this is stuff to discuss, I suppose, for now, is I would say probably creating a manifesto / campaign list. I think that's the next thing that we should focus on, kind of a detailed thing on, right, what would we actually be campaigning on? What do we want to change within that? And in that, we need expertise to know what is going to make a difference. We need the James Stephens in this to be able to make sure that we can shut down the legal loopholes. That's what I would suggest we should focus on. And then we can put together a separate framework, of the ideal financial society based on the Old Testament stuff. If we put together a manifesto, then to talk with other city professionals, accountants, auditors, investment bankers, all of that stuff, to get as many of them, I suppose, on board as possible, and to check that what we're talking about is sound, makes sense, has rigor, would make an impact, but start to try and get others involved within that, and then use the arts and the media and the church to change the law. I mean, I say that as though it's simple, just do that. Create a mass movement in the country using those things, but that's how you change the law. That's how Wilberforce and his mates did it. Other things within that, you can figure out particular products to boycott, and that's really powerful if you can link a specific product with the injustice. So like the Clapham Sect encouraged people to stop drinking sugar, because they said if you put sugar in your tea, you're actually enabling this slave trade. It's figuring out a way to take this big, complex, ethereal, financial justice vague issue and turn it into an actual commodity, a specific thing, and say, no, this is an example of what we need to stop and change. So are there things that we might boycott? Petitions, again, Wilberforce did that, one of the pioneers in that. We know that the UK government has the system is that if a petition online has 100,000 signatures, they have to debate it is it not necessarily in Parliament, but in Westminster Hall, and it starts to become part of the consciousness of the legislative process. Is that a way to go? Partnering with NGOs, and maybe especially Christian NGOs, to support or to scale up an existing campaign, and therefore we could look at what other NGOs are doing. But I do think, although there are groups like Christian Aid and Tax Justice Network looking at stuff, they don't seem to be focused so much on money laundering. They talk about, can we get multinational companies to stop doing their price transferring and to pay a fair share of tax? And I think that's useful, but I think actually it's the money laundering that's the bigger issue. And if we could solve that, that would solve so many other justice issues. But do we figure out NGOs to be able to work with and work through on all of that? Can we figure out a small group concept, a thing that churches can create? The Clapham Sect set up all of their different local societies, branches that would then campaign locally, involve people in that, figure out what they can do to meaningfully bring change or bring more awareness and more people involved in something. We could put together a small group course. Churches love small group courses, and they're always looking for new resources. We could put together something on financial justice or biblical finance, biblical financial justice, that educates generally on stuff, and then maybe ends with us sharing our campaign requests and inviting people into an ongoing relationship or to get involved in somehow. We've got an amazing venue at Central Hall, Westminster. We could host annual, or even more than that, twice a year. Let's have debates, let's have speakers. We could get MPs, we could do stuff there and create kind of flagship events to create momentum on whatever it is that we want to campaign on. So I think we've got a lot of assets once we've figured out what it is that we want to campaign on that is achievable and that will make a biggest impact, which is where I'd advocate trying to eliminate the money laundering stuff. Oh, and a little bit of encouragement that I would share as well. There is a theory that every 500 years the world changes and there are these massive shifts. So you could talk about 500 years ago, kind of around 1500 AD. Columbus discovered the New World 8 years before. Yes, I know there were already people living there, so discovered it, but discovered it for Europeans who weren't Vikings, And then soon after that, or caught up within that period, you've got the Renaissance, with a massive change in how people understand the arts, and Michelangelo creating his masterpieces. You've got the mass adoption of the printing press from 1500 onwards. And then from 1517, the Reformation and Martin Luther totally transforming the understanding of Christianity and rediscovering the truth of salvation by faith, by grace. So there is this theory every 500 years, there are massive changes in the world. I think there are some that have started to change in the late 20th century. You talk about how commercial flights totally opened up the world from the 60s onwards. The computer revolution from the 70s and the 80s massively changed stuff, the technological revolution, and that led to an information revolution. Is it time for a financial revolution? Well, why not? Those are massive things, but maybe the time is right for a huge change. And if we can change things now, would that last for another 500 years and try and eliminate, well, my theory, I know I've said this before, I think if we could eliminate money laundering, you eliminate so many other injustices within the modern world as well. Okay, I think I've talked for longer than I planned to again.